Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this event by the British Norwegian Chamber of Commerce on Norway and the UK, the future power region of Europe. To start with a safety briefing, there are exits on the left and at the back here, and just follow the green signs if the alarm goes off. There are no alarms planned, and muster at the front of the building. Norway and the UK have a long-standing history of cooperation and partnership, and the BNCC has as its purpose to build on that legacy and to encourage cross-border investment and knowledge sharing between our two countries. We hold a number of events throughout the year, and one I particularly like to highlight to you is London Calling, which is taking place on the 18th to 20th of October. This is going to have an incredible program. If you sign up, you will get to meet Labour MPs in the Churchill Room in the House of Commons. You'll get to meet the campaign manager for Jeremy Hunt, the Mayor of London, and a lot of other interesting things besides. So it's a unique opportunity to get behind the scenes of British politics, business, and culture. So with that, I'd like to thank Aker Solutions very much for hosting this event, and I'll hand over to Stephen Bull, who is Chair of Renewable UK and EVP for Aker Solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us live on a Monday morning and also online event as well. So before we get into debate and discussion around which is the juicy stuff we'd like to be talking about, I'd like to introduce Jan Thompson, who's the newly appointed UK ambassador to Norway first for some opening and address.
Thank you very much. I was just making sure not to bend down, so because as I kind of lean over, the microphone seems to kind of slip. I think it reminded me a bit of being the king at his coronation. I think, you know, once the crown's on, he couldn't look down, he couldn't look up at the flypast. But anyway, sorry, that was if you're not interested in the coronation, that was probably a boring opening remark. But it does seem to have been the main thing happening this weekend, as far as I'm concerned, with lots of events and things going on, and I've been following it, glued to it on TV. But anyway, so it's a big weekend for the UK. But thank you very much. I want to first of all say thanks very much to the BNCC and to Aker Solutions for hosting this event. It's wonderful to have it going on, and great also to have the State Secretary here. Thanks very much for coming along. And I'm completely new in town, I should say, so I haven't really met anyone here yet. I think a couple of you I've seen on Teams meetings, but otherwise not really. I just arrived in town about a week or so ago, so I'm completely brand new. I presented my credentials to King Harold last week, so I'm now officially in place. And I also had the privilege of meeting King Charles when I was, before I came out, because all new ambassadors get to have an audience with the king before. Can you hear me okay, by the way? I should have checked that. Yeah, good. All new ambassadors get to have a sort of private audience with the king. And funnily enough, I'm not allowed to reveal any of the details of that, but he was, we were talking about the UK-Norway energy relationship, interestingly, and he was, I think it's fair to say he was very complimentary about Norway and how it manages things, including its oil fund and many other things. And of course, he was also very positive and warm about Norway. Obviously, really strong family links between our two royal families, and lots of history and lots of friendship and affection and positivity. So he was very warm about all of that. So it's nice to kind of come here off the back of that. And I was able to pass on those greetings when I met the king here as well. So that's kind of the background. And my background is I've just been, the last 4 years, I've been in India and working. And the 4 years before that, I was ambassador in Prague in the Czech Republic. Way back before that, at one point, I was the UK's lead international climate negotiator. So I've got a bit of a history around some of these issues, but I'm absolutely not an energy expert. But I saw the title of this event today and thought, even though I'm only 3 days in, I probably should come along to this because it's going to be a really important and big part of my job. So I thought it would, among other things, I thought it would just be a really nice opportunity for me to kind of learn and hear and meet people and get to know some of these issues. So it felt like an opportunity I couldn't miss. And I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion, all of whom are much more expert than me, so that I can learn a lot as well. So really, I thought it was a great opportunity to come, and also I just wanted to kind of signal that this is an important topic that matters a lot to me, and I know will be a really big part of my work. And of course, this whole energy topic has just grown in importance with developments of late, not least developments in Ukraine, sadly, just making energy security all the more important. And also, of course, as we know, clean energy continues to remain a key consideration for all of us, and will continue to do so, I guess, in the years to come. And what I do know already is the UK and Norway work so closely across all of this agenda, 50 years, more than 50 years of working together to make the North Sea one of the most technologically advanced energy centres, if not the most technologically advanced energy centre in the world. And it was great to see the UK and Norway recommitting to that in Ostend last month. And I think we're going to need to do that if we're going to be able to develop and deploy the technologies that we're going to need at scale and at speed. Offshore wind, obviously the UK has gone through its own kind of revolution on offshore wind, and I think we've learned an awful lot along the way of doing that, both about how you need to have a really clear vision, what you need to do in terms of regulation and licensing and the incentives for industry, and of course, most of all, how to actually work collaboratively with industry and with companies. And not least, we've done an awful lot of that with Norwegian companies who have brought a huge amount of expertise and skills and energy and commitment. So I think all of that just shows that the UK is incredibly well placed to partner with Norway as Norway embarks on its own offshore wind adventure. And then electricity export of electricity, I know, is quite a sensitive topic sometimes here in Norway, but of course it goes in both directions. And as we need to secure our supply and bring down costs, it does obviously make sense to try and work together on all of that. And in the UK, we're continuing to try and diversify on solar further and nuclear. But also both of our countries working together really closely on, or both working together to develop further options on hydrogen and CCUS. So I just think there's an awful lot we can do together. And that's probably as much as I'll say for now, because I really want to hear from the panel. But I just wanted to kind of give some opening comments and say a little bit about me. Hope that's okay, Stephen. Yeah, good. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. So let's get going with the discussions then. So first we're going to call out Andreas Bjelland Eriksen. He is the State Secretary for the Department of Oil and Energy. Come and join me. We're going to split ourselves across these tables here. And then we've got Tor Numedal, who's Statnett. He's the Head of Business Development for Offshore Development. Please. Anna Musat, Executive Director for Policy Engagement at Renewable UK. We've got Stine Wete, who's the Vice President of Floating Offshore Wind at Aker Solutions, and Kjetil Digre, CEO of Aker Solutions, who's just getting mic'd up now and will be joining us in a second. Whilst we wait for Kjetil to come along here, I just want to give a little bit of an opening remarks from the panel. And Andreas, I wanted to kick off a bit with you just to talk about your role and also what Norway is doing with its ambitions within offshore wind.
Yeah, thank you so much. And first, let me start by welcoming the ambassador to Norway. This is the weather that we have here all the time. So, you're in for a real treat, almost like in India, I would imagine. And also congratulations on the coronation. I mean, it almost feels like we've had our own coronation of our offshore wind ambitions in Norway lately, because, I mean, finally we have got going. A lot of other countries around us have done much more than us the last couple of years, unfortunately, but now we're sort of at the table. We have concrete projects. We've started with Utsira Nord and Sørlige Nordsjø II, and now we're really ramping up the speed of the work to realize our ambitions in practice. We just got presented the report by a group of directorates on future areas for offshore wind in Norway. We will, from the government side, take that report and quickly develop that into a pipeline so that the industry will have knowledge of the future plans for offshore wind in Norway. And then obviously we will continuously utilize rounds to award areas and also to evaluate and learn from the processes that we had. And then I think we are also getting more and more integrated into the development of the future power region of Europe. We're a member of NSEC, and we're very happy that the UK is back as an observer in NSEC, or the North Sea Cooperation. We were at Ostende with both our Prime Minister and Minister for Petroleum and Energy, and we take a very keen interest in the work being done now on hybrid cables and regulatory frameworks, market frameworks, etc., for developing offshore wind. So I think it's right to say that we finally have claimed our place at the table, and then we need to work hard together to be able to realize our ambitions in practice.
Thank you, Andreas. We'll pick up on some of those points in a bit. Well, I want to move over to Anna, so we can tell a little bit more about Renewable UK role in the UK's development, and also kind of what's hot, what's not in the UK market at the moment.
Great, thanks, Stephen, and hi, everyone. Delighted to be here. So just to introduce Renewable UK first, we're the biggest trade association for renewable energy in the UK. So we represent all renewable technologies from offshore and onshore wind, green hydrogen, as well as storage and flexibility solutions. And it's worth saying that we also cover the developers as well as the supply chain. So pretty well placed to see how the market's evolved over time. And I think in terms of Norway having a seat at the table, I think that's been true for a while, actually. We've got quite a lot of companies in our membership who are Norwegian, have been making quite a lot of investments in the UK. So I think the Ostende summit that happened last month is just a true testament of how well the two countries are collaborating. I think in terms of the UK, obviously we've done pretty well in terms of offshore wind deployment. We've got the largest installed capacity anywhere in the world, and the pipeline's looking really healthy. I think now, however, we're moving into a new phase because there's very strong international competition for the technology, for investment, and for supply chains as well. Obviously, we've got the US Inflation Reduction Act that's got quite a strong pull when it comes to the investment, the skills, and the supply chain. So I think our two countries have a really big role to play in terms of collaborating to keep the business environment attractive here and ensuring that we don't miss out on those investment opportunities. I also think that in terms of offshore wind, the technology is moving into a new phase of maturity. We've seen costs come down quite a lot, and I think we're now moving into industrialization. So really important to think about how we can build the supply chains, how we can make them stronger. And it's worth saying that in terms of reaching our ambitions for offshore wind, it's really important that we have those supply chains because otherwise we're not going to be able to build as much as we need to in order to guarantee our energy security. And just finally to say, obviously skills, again, really important. We've got so many people that we need to employ to make the energy transition happen. So again, really important that we collaborate. I think on both skills and supply chain, the good news is that we don't have to do everything ourselves. We've got different competitive advantages, and it's really worth drawing on those and then working together to make the transition happen.
Thank you, Anna. So there's no point producing all these electrons unless we get them to market. So we need to get transmission, we need to get the grid going. So this is where I want to bring in Tord and tell us about Statnet's role in the energy future in the North Sea.
Yes, Statnet is a transmission operator in Norway, and for UK participants, we are kind of the sister company of National Grid. And we also have a long history of cooperation with National Grid. But our role is basically on onshore grid is to build, own and operate the transmission system, which is kind of the highway electricity system, the high voltage system. And when we look at what's happening in offshore wind, we are extremely concerned about looking at onshore and offshore as one energy system. So in many ways, we are trying to make sure that the regulations and the rules offshore are going to match with onshore. And of course, cooperation across borders is going to be extremely important in achieving that, because you cannot just look at your own system, you need to look at the holistic way. And we were pleased to see that this view is shared in the UK. We saw a report now from the champion of offshore wind, pointing at the importance of actually looking at your onshore network to match what's happening offshore. That's one important thing, and we also look at the way that UK is developing a holistic network plan. Again, in many ways, the way we are looking at it as well. So we want to look at offshore and onshore as one energy system, basically.
Thank you. Let's move specifically to floating. Stina, what is it about Aker Solutions and stuff that floats?
Stuff that floats. I think it is a history of Aker Solutions that for decades have been building and handling large, complex projects with floating structures for oil and gas, but taking that knowledge and learnings we have from that into the offshore wind, and then looking into the floating wind market, it's really complex. Where we know that we have demonstrators out there now, which is floating, but taking that from one-offs to building the largest scale, bringing in then Aker Solutions' competence of constructability, construction, optimization of the design, installation friendliness of design to make this more efficient, cost efficient, and also make this market happen, floating wind happen. I think that's kind of the combination that we brings into the market and into the industry. And also a lot of learnings we have from Tampen, where we learned how to do this efficiently. How can we do installations in 1 season instead of 2 seasons? How can we, in all steps of the supply chain, make it more efficient? So not just thinking about the best design, but also optimize it for the different project steps.
Thank you. Let's move over to Kjetil. Let's hear a bit your reflections, a little bit about Aker Solutions' role in a sense also to develop the North Sea for many different energy forms.
Yeah, I feel we have this sort of golden opportunity. 2020 was not easy for any of us, but anyway, it was sort of the start of something that comes towards us as this huge opportunity. Not only continuing oil and gas, but also having all these different paths into new energy verticals where we have industry projects to solve. And for a company like ours, that sort of redefine our strategy to actually be part of that. You know, again, that's been excellent. But then, if you look at then the task of doing that, you know, it's you could perhaps wind back to the start of the oil age 50 years ago. What happened then? You know, we were not dealing with any of the stuff within oil and gas at that time. But then you mobilized, you know, both politics, you mobilized frameworks. You had an idea on how to sort of use other competence areas, foreign or others, to grow competence and the muscle of Norwegian industry around oil and gas. And when we look back to those years, we were hardly born. You know, we're talking about that as something really courageous, and they were thinking out of the box. And so having this opportunity now, redefining the whole industry, the energy mix and everything. If you wind forward 10, 20 years and look back, what are the radical things we are doing? And I'm a bit unsure that we are challenging the ideas of how to tackle this all together. And we just point at a few things. First of all, I feel lucky. So now I'm coming to a list of slightly negative topics, but you know, this is a really good spot to be in. But then if you want to make it more optimal, I think we have to start with what Stine alludes to. You know, this is an industry that needs to change, you know, as we say, on the shoulders of oil and gas. We need to use the competence we have, the people, the common framework with authorities, employers, and us as companies. But we also need to find new versions of ourselves. It's about, you know, becoming leaner. It's about you know, last year we onboarded 3,000 new employees, 2,000 this year. So many people are then linked to the new energy verticals. Technology, you know, we need to arrive at new concepts. You know, oil and gas is complex, and we want to solve, you know, the Barents Sea kind of challenges. And then suddenly we need to work at making it simpler and simpler. Thirdly, the way that we have to sort of invest hundreds of millions into our assets to make them, as you said, more industrialized. So there's a investment, there's a bet in all of this that needs some security and some predictability. And then, as you said, mobilizing the supply in the industry. There are two sort of topics there for me. One is that we are rethinking, and we should do more rethinking around how you partner up in this. Again, roles are not defined, and we don't have to do everything. We can join forces with others and then also integrate differently with the developers. But then it needs to be, again, thought about a bit more openly, I think. And then, the last topic is, we are now in these different projects together with other suppliers, and there's a lot of opportunities out there, but it is not a walk in the park at all. And then it becomes to this sort of broken model, as we call it, and it starts with the governance, the regime of actually getting to the opportunities for developers, and then that is fixed. That is a starting point where you have been competing, and it's really pushed down. And you said that costs are going down. You have some costs coming down, but you have others that really escalates and go the other way. And we have not many stories about supplier constellations that has actually done it one cycle around and earned a lot of money. It's rather the contrary. So the auction principle, the CFT way of thinking, fixed price, that's the start of a race, and it's a race to the bottom rather than sort of using some years to get control over this. So then if you should have a radical thought, you'd almost like this Sørlige Nordsjø and Utsira to be a sort of a mobilization period for the whole cluster around these industry tasks, rather than, again, start with a race and then see who wins that in the first round, and then particularly on the Sørlige Nordsjø, likely to be more foreign companies than Norwegian ones. So,
okay, there's a lot to unpick there, and we will. Definitely. What we do is I want to bring Andreas in for a little bit, and maybe just set some context a bit first. I think particularly we're talking about the North Sea. So about 75% of Europe's offshore wind turbines are in the North Sea. It's about a 30 gigawatt market today. We're looking at 120 gigawatts by 2030, still driven by the UK being the largest and fastest growth market. And then about 260 gigawatts potential by 2050. So that's 85% of what the EU has talked about of its 300 gigawatt target. And there's been a lot of studies that even Norway itself had probably 280 gigawatts itself of potential areas just off the coast of Norway itself. So huge opportunities and growth potential, no doubt about it. For those of us who work within projects, 2030 it's like tomorrow. It's not very long. Andreas, to ask you a bit about that. You've got 30 gigawatt target by 2040. You've got 20 new offshore wind areas, which you mentioned here now. But how do we really get steel in the water faster? How do we actually get that deployment as quickly as possible?
First, foremost, just let me state clearly that one could often start talking about gigawatts just to talk about gigawatts, but we do not build these constructions for fun. We build them for a reason. Why? Right? We build them because we need a lot of new renewable power production going forward if we are to be able to reach our goals of decarbonization, electrification, developing new and existing green industry. I think that's a very important premise, and this should really foster how we think about designing markets, how these constructions should benefit Norwegian households, industry, etc., and UK households, industry, etc., going forward as well. But we need, as the Norwegian Energy Commission has stated very clearly, to do everything faster, right? That's what we need to do, and that, from a government perspective, I think that we should have a good division of labor. We should do what we can and what we are good at being responsible for. So we need to work more in parallel. We need to ensure that the permit times are efficient. We need to ensure that we are able to develop new areas fast enough. And we need to be able to set up the criteria in a way that allows the industry to grow and develop. And I think we have done quite a few smart things with Sørlige Nordsjø 2 and Utsira Nord. And then there are obviously things that we have to learn from, evaluate. A lot of you know that the contracts for difference are being discussed in the parliament right now. So we need to make sure that we develop on this over time. But just a point on what Kjetil said. One example is that in our criteria, we have put in that the project that you pre-qualify on for Sørlige Nordsjø 2 or that you are awarded an area for in Utsira Nord that project, when you come to the final competition for government support, the final project cannot be qualitatively worse than the project that you bid in originally. And that's just an example of how we at least can combine the best of having to compete for state aid, because we know that if we are to be successful with the green shift, we need a lot of state aid, but we also need to utilize that state aid in an efficient way. So competition is good because it drives the need for aid down, but at the same time, we have a strong qualitatively competition as well. So then you get balance between the need for government support, but at the same time, the need to score well on qualitative criteria. And when you then have sustainability, you have development of value chains, you have a lot of these criteria built into the qualitative part of the process, I think we can design projects that will score not perfectly, but well on many criteria. And I think that is absolutely key if we are to succeed going forward.
Thank you. Let's pick up on some of those points then. I think particularly to bring in Anna on this one here. So you're an expert on the UK offshore wind market, on the policy and the regulatory side. Now, Norway's obviously, it's developing, and it's you know, say there's discussion in the parliament at the moment. You've got qualitative criteria, you've got quantitative criteria, you've got different balance of different CFDs and structures there, both between floating and fixed. But for, you know, I think particularly for the audience here, is that what lessons learned do you think the UK could provide to Norway to actually get this right, and also to try and find which strategic industries Norway should be trying to focus on to build a supply chain?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because obviously there's the opportunity to leapfrog some of the things that maybe we haven't done so well. I think in terms of getting the support mechanism, the CFD is a really great one. It's enabled costs to come down, as I said, but I think in terms of setting out the policy objectives from the beginning, it's really important to consider not just price. I think something that we've done in the UK is we've always been set on driving the price down and ensuring we've got good competition, good levels of investment. What I think we could have done better is setting a policy objective alongside that to say, okay, but we're also going to build a supply chain alongside it, and we're going to have some very clear mechanisms to do that. I think what's been tried in the past is kind of bolting that onto the CFD mechanism, which, you know, has had various degree of success. But I think having an industrial policy that says we're driving costs down, we're installing this, but also we're trying to build the factories alongside it, and we're trying to get the deployment. Ultimately, you know, that's what drives most of the socioeconomic benefits, and that's how it gets people bought into the industry. So I think it would have been really important to have that consistently in place for the longer term. I think also in terms of developing the skills, as I've mentioned, again, having that part of the industrial policy would be really critical. And I think something that we've come across, and it's been touched on as part of the panel already, stuff like grid planning, I think we haven't quite realized from the very beginning how much of a challenge that was going to be. And I think when we install projects now, you know, we have wait times of 10 years plus in terms of connecting to the grid, and it's something that we're really focused on solving. But I think it would have been great to try to solve that from the very beginning and build that grid infrastructure ahead of time. So I think, you know, my advice would be just, sort it out as quickly as possible, because it's going to become very painful further down the line.
Thank you. Therefore, we've got to pick up on grid here. So I think obviously I'm going to bring in Tor here, but about 15% of Europe's electrons are traded between countries, and some more and some less between certain countries. There's bottlenecks, but you were personally involved when you was project director for the North Sea Link to the UK. Can you talk about what do you think the prospects could be for interconnectors or not in the future, and what role will they play in terms of actually bringing all these gigawatts offshore wind to market?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I don't think we are looking at now any kind of direct interconnectors. We are looking at interconnectors or connections associated with offshore wind. That's the concepts we're looking at now. So we're working with all TSOs in Europe, including National Grid, of course, in trying to develop concepts that's good in a bilateral sense, but also fits into a bigger picture. So I think, you know, what I would like to highlight in this picture is the need for similar concepts and looking at how these can be connected, and that means looking across projects, not only looking at one project at a time. It's going to be extremely important, especially for the grid system, that you can think of more than one project at a time. If not, it's going to be very challenging to see how a grid is developed. And to achieve that, I think what we're seeing now is a big need for standardization. We need to make sure that we're not all finding, inventing the wheel in every single office, but try to establish standardized solutions. And we're seeing that that's happening now. And of course, we can see that especially in Germany and Netherlands, they are doing a lot of standardization around specific voltage levels, specific concepts for HVDC stations, cable systems, and they also very innovative with respect to contract models. So you mentioned strategic agreements, and that looks at more than one project. And I think TenneT in Germany has entered into some 15-16 contracts on 2 gigawatt solutions for offshore hubs now, which is almost unbelievable. And I think you mentioned, maybe the most difficult thing of this business is to understanding the scale of things and the speed of things. So I think standardization and in Statnett we're also extremely concerned about interoperability, which is a strange word, but the ability of the various systems to talk together independent of vendor. And I think that's going to be key if you're going to have a system that we can call an offshore grid that talks to each other and talks to each country at the same time. So yes, standardization is a key word to making things happen in big volumes and happen fast. And of course, the big word for everybody is predictability in that respect.
Yep. I'm going to bring Kjetil in a minute. Just to check one thing, Tord, is you said about standardization. Is this actually happening at the right level? Is it the TSO level, or is it political, or is it a civil service discussion?
Well, this is of course a big discussion, but we are seeing that it's happening a lot on TSO levels with respect to grid. And I'm talking, as a grid person, and yes, we are seeing that most companies or most TSO are now standardizing at 525 kilovolt as the level and it's hard to see that that's not going to be the basis for an offshore grid in a way. And also the 2 gigawatt stations are pretty standard, but I think the voltage levels are the most important thing. The size of the stations could develop and could be handled within the system, but I think technically, I think the voltage level is the most important, and also that you are able to think what's going to be there in the end and not optimize for every single project. That's going to be key.
Thank you. Kjetil, let's bring
There
you
was
in.
just one supporting comment and then one question, but the supporting one is this standardization topic, because part of the uncertainty is the importance of possessing some sort of technology edge. And then if you think that's important, you will continuously try to push the borders and invent new things. And part of that is okay, competition and everything, but then also the industry would have quite some, it would benefit from having some, hvilepools, and start delivering standard things that we are controlling rather than pushing the limits. So standardization is key to all these different components. But just the question is, you're talking about, connecting countries, but then I've been working electrification, oil and gas quite a lot. And then when we are, call it mating onshore and offshore, that's extremely complex, different regulators, different specifications and regimes. So when you look at all of this, how do you see this overall architecture role? Because these topics are linked not only onshore, offshore, but also when you are developing parallel wind parks. I'm an engineer, so the solutions you arrive at technically is dependent on how you orchestrate the totality.
Absolutely.
When and how are we sort of getting into a room where we are discussing the architecture, you think?
Well, I think we are discussing it already, but it's Statnett has been given a planning role for the North Sea, the Norwegian North Sea, and also the system operating role. It's the content of that role is still being developed, but I think that if this is going to happen, it's going to depend on European cooperation. You cannot sit and design your own little system without thinking about the others, and that's what's happening. The State Secretary mentioned NSEC is a big arena also for us to make sure that we are talking together and are doing the same thing. And also in Statnett, as I mentioned earlier, we are talking to all TSO, we're talking to Energinet, we're talking to Tenet, we're talking to Amprion, Elia, and National Grid, of course. And this is on the table every time. We need to look at what is the target ahead and how do we achieve that. And of course, as I mentioned, with a project-focused mind, it's hard to do investments that also facilitate something that's going to maybe happen in the future. And that's why I think that the TSO need to have a big role in establishing those hubs offshore that can serve specific wind parks, but also be prepared to connect up for what happens later. That's the.
Can we bring Andreas here, because this is there's a political dimension here, I think, which is important to take in.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to elaborate a bit, because I think it's important to sort of remember that electrons are electrons no matter where they're produced, right? So it doesn't make sense to create a totally different power system offshore than the one we have onshore, because it needs to function with the existing onshore power system in practice. And I think that's really important when we talk about integrating this into, for example, existing market structures, not designing completely new market structures for offshore generation. But that at the same time, we know that in certain areas there is a potential to discuss whether or not this should be somewhat differently, at least, than from, for example, the current traditional interconnectors that we have today. And we have been very concerned with sort of raising the perspective on the division of benefits and costs from hybrid connections, for example. What should go to the offshore wind park? What should go to the customers onshore? How should this be distributed in practice? I think it's important, for example, that bottleneck incomes still are utilized to reduce the cost of the network tariffs onshore. That's my perspective. But that's because that's the biggest benefit that customers onshore actually get from these connectors. So if you take that away and give that and utilize that to subsidize the wind park instead, well, then you need some other benefit given to customers onshore, at least, to make sure that this has a holistic perspective also on the customer producer division side. And I think there are a lot of these issues, especially on benefits and costs, that we need to raise to the public discussion, because we know that those are difficult issues in a Norwegian context. And then on the purely sort of power system perspective, it's really about utilizing the competencies of the TSOs, the energy cooperation that we already have, the system that we already have, and further develop that, not to completely construct something new for offshore wind.
Thank you. Let's take a sort of a little deviation around here and talk about actually electrification of oil and gas. And we'll talk about, so obviously in an energy security context for Europe, the North Sea remains and is obviously more important than ever, particularly when it comes to gas for European markets. But obviously this has to be in a net zero context as well. You know, then one thing is actually tackling CO2 emissions through carbon capture storage or through other opportunities with technology. But at the production level of oil and gas itself and the reduction of CO2 emissions. Maybe I'll start off a bit with Stina. So we talk about you're involved in Hywind Tampen, which for Equinor, which Aker Solutions helps develop for the client. Can you tell us a bit about that and tell us a bit about some of the technical issues around electrification of oil and gas? And I'm going to come to Anna and think a bit more about the policy side.
Technical issues with respect to net zero? Or? Yeah. I think it is a lot of options that you could choose, kind of having more sustainable options, going to net zero. You have a lot of initiatives in the market that you can think about. But it's also about kind of thinking about the whole system. I think in general, the life cycle system, you can think about life cycle assessments. You can think about, okay, what does it help actually with the CO2 emission reductions? You can have initiatives on building Tampen with low carbon concrete, or you can have green steel. But I think also thinking about more on the offshore wind race and the sense of urgency that we see here, since this is a wind context, that we have this cost reduction race, we have this sense of urgency, we have all these different contract structures, ownership challenges. So also with that, those factors, thinking about, okay, who should take the investments in taking the green steel, who do want to pay the extra for low carbon fuel, low carbon concrete, who wants to take those extra costs when you also have the push to reduce the cost at all levels all the time.
Sounds like a role for oil and gas companies, doesn't it?
That's the oil and gas role, and they like that role. They prefer to do those, but the wind developers are not that into it yet, even though they are really talking about the net zero race.
Okay. I'll come to you, Shedley. Yeah.
Just a very quick one.
Yeah,
There's a lot of politics and disagreements around electrification and all of that. But I think for Norway, and again, industry and developers, that as sort of learning steps. It's happening and it's happening fast, and we are not only sort of getting technology, subsea and whatnot in place, but also maturing things that are really relevant for the next sort of wind era. So I like that part of it, and then obviously I'm a bit saddened by the Trollvind slowdown, because that would also been sort of a really important step for Norway. But all in all, very good for us as an industry.
We'll come back a bit on the Norwegian dimension of and where maybe government has a role to try and help drive electrification for oil and gas with using offshore wind. But I know there's this INTOG, isn't there, at the moment, which is the Innovation Targeted Oil and Gas in the UK, which is an initiative towards about decarbonisation for oil and gas. Can you tell us a bit what the scene is like in the UK for this?
Yeah, I think it's seen as a fairly exciting opportunity, because actually that means you bring in renewables and you help build them in order to help decarbonize oil and gas installations. And I think the innovation part is really critical there, because the more support we can bring to bear on innovative technologies like floating offshore wind, the better. And I think a lot of the projects that we've seen successful through the INTOG leasing rounds have been on the floating offshore wind side. And I think in order to achieve that scale, we honestly need to build these for all the purposes that might be needed. I think there's also an acknowledgement that we have all these transferable skills on the oil and gas side in terms of working at sea, putting the installations there, and doing the health and safety requirements. I think it's really important to draw on those as much as we can on the renewable side. So I think it's seen as a really positive thing. It's also going to enable the cost to come down as we start building more floating offshore wind for those purposes. And then hopefully in a few years we'll see the costs being really competitive with fixed bottom.
Okay, thank you. Andreas, but on the policy side, one thing is you've obviously full focus on Sørlige Nordsjø 2, Utsira, make it a success, but there's a huge, isn't there, sort of low-hanging fruit around decarbonisation of oil and gas with offshore wind?
Absolutely, and I think it's very important. I think sometimes in Norway, the electrification debate is framed somewhat wrongly, because it shouldn't be a debate pro or against electrification of the oil and gas industry. It should be, how can we electrify these installations in a way that do not take away opportunities from new industry onshore, and offshore wind obviously have a huge potential role to play there. And then I think as the sort of most important work that we do on ensuring that offshore wind is developed quick enough will be the regular rounds that we will have, and working on awarding areas regularly, and with a good pipeline that the industry knows about. But then when we have been working on Trollvind, and from our perspective, Trollvind is still important and interesting. Our role in that is to try to develop a framework that can work well for those kind of projects, and perhaps most importantly in a period sort of before 2030, so that those can be available. And then those projects, as all other offshore wind projects, they have a challenge right now with very much increased costs in the supply chain. There is a strong pressure. Everything is happening at once, and costs have increased a lot also due to COVID-19 and the situation after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So that needs to be tackled. But from our perspective, we want to develop a framework for those kind of projects, because we absolutely see that they can play an important role, especially towards 2030, on contributing with enough new electricity into the system so that we both can electrify oil and gas installation at the same time utilize the big opportunities that we have onshore for new industry in Norway.
Okay, positive singles there, but definitely for decarbonisation for oil and gas. Tord, let's bring you in.
Yeah, I think it's an extremely good point, and we're using the Norwegian phrase hav og land hand i hand, offshore and onshore hand in hand. And I think that looking at development, especially floating wind, in connection with offshore oil and gas and the grid onshore, is a very good thing. And I also like to point out that in the pre-works of the Sørlige Nordsjø II, we were looking at, of course, the close distance between Ekofisk and Sørlige Nordsjø, and the Ekofisk has performed a lot of studies over the years on electrification. And of course, the connection to the beach with the cable is kind of the big obstacle cost-wise. And if you look at the distance between Ekofisk and Sørlige Nordsjø now, we believe that there is an opportunity there for electrification of Ekofisk through that system. And of course, that's also become part of the competition in Sørlige Nordsjø that the consortium will have to present some kind of opinion on how that can be done. And of course, this is a commercial decision that I can make, but I think it illustrates the opportunity that's there when you put wind close to an oil and gas installation.
Thank you. Andreas?
Yeah, it's just a good point of how you can utilize criteria to try to achieve a lot in practice. And then you should put it together in a way that ensure that it's actually benefit as a net to society. And as was mentioned, we put this in that if you have a plan and an agreement on electrification of Ekofisk, that will be positively rated in the competition for Sørlige Nordsjø II. And then I believe as well, if you're able to do that, there should be a reasonable split of costs for building the grid solution. So the cost of the grid solution actually being integrated into the project as well, you could actually get a cheaper project by being able to cooperate together with Ekofisk in practice. And I think this is how we need to think. We need to set up a framework. I mean, there is a strong framework in place already in Norway today with the high taxes that we have on CO2 emissions from petroleum industry to actually do these projects in practice. And then we have to combine them with kind of qualitative criteria in some way to ensure that they're net beneficial to society as a whole.
Very good, thank you. Let's move on to the supply chain, because obviously there's one issue has been itself is that even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the supply chain was getting pretty tight. And after deglobalization you've had all the issues left over from COVID, and there are still many bottlenecks in the system we see globally. Kjetil, maybe kick off a bit with you. Where do you see the bottlenecks, and what do you see as ways of trying to solve some of this to actually get the level of deployment that we need for offshore wind in Europe?
First of all, again, just as a starting point, this is our responsibility also to find out, arrive at the standards and concepts, with partners out there on the supplier side, find the right kind of complementary partnerships that make sense. So there's a lot of work on our side. But then back again to the sort of gaps or bottlenecks, de-risking in this sort of bankability project financing terms is not about taking down the risk in these projects. It's about sheltering the developer and the banks from that risk. And just now it's like this burning cannonball that I just put down the supply chain. And that is not de-risking anything. It's just reshuffling it. And I think that's at least the starting point. And these things happen so early. It's happening at the sort of the first quarter of sort of a project process. And at that point in time, you don't have everything fixed. The design, the other contributors, perhaps schedules, and all of this is not fixed enough to take those kind of bets. So that's where we meet up on some expectations for us to take all risk and everything on lump sum. That's the project term around this. Whilst what we think we should do is to mature things together across the early phases of a project, and then push the button when we have control together. And this sort of non-synchronized way of having to take a bet has materialized in many projects sort of going the wrong way, and also many contractors both losing money and then also pulling out, and that last part is probably the most critical one, because if you translate your numbers, and I think this is a bit sort of a high-level translation, but our goal of offshore wind to 2040 means something like 1,000 big units in 15 years. Norwegian industry, and the way we assess it, is that we can probably do 30 a year. And then if you take the EU ambitions or European ambitions altogether, that is 1,000 units per year. And again, Norway together, we can lift 30. So there's something about not getting too burnt, but actually survive this mobilization phase, and not only survive and be available for this huge undertaking, but also make sure that we are growing capacity, not out-competing each other all the time, but also growing the cumulative capacity in the best possible way the coming years. And there, I'm not sure that I don't see the final solution, at least. And last thing is just capacity is needed. So, competing in different countries means that you might, establish factories and the likes, revitalize yards that is needed. So that's good. But then also look across borders. Where does it make most sense to establish which kind of capacity, and not only sort of require that you have one of each in every corner of the areas where you are developing offshore wind. I think is also an important discussion.
I suppose maybe picking up there on the floating side, and maybe Stina, just thinking particularly, going floating. Norway's not going to solve the floating issue alone. Neither will Scotland. So it's more this cooperation element. But Stina, what are your reflections on this point on the supply chain?
I think it is, as you said, the capacity is really limited. So we need to work together to figure out, okay, one thing is to build the capacity hubs around. Where should we be specialists in the different topics, but also work together on the learnings and sharing what we learn in this race together. So one thing is to figure out, okay, how to build this quick enough, but also what do we do with the O&M at a later stage? How do we get around with the supply chain? How do we get? We have some turbine manufacturers kind of in Europe, which is controlling a lot of the market today. And how can we work on this kind of together with the UK? We are both developing in the North Sea. Maybe we can think about the fleet together, the yards, and learning from each other. UK has built a lot, and we have a lot to learn from them as well.
Let's just pick up on this point here. So this is something from Renewable UK. It was a floating offshore wind task force. Excuse me for reading it here, but it talked about this need for port investments to scale floating, and I know you were part of this, and it talked about £4 billion investment across 11 ports in the UK, and it calculated that for every pound invested in UK port facilities, it would generate £4.30 value of added value to the economy. Why are we spending more money on ports? It's a no-brainer, isn't it?
It is a no-brainer, but I think the problem is really who pays for it and whose risk is it to bear. I think that's something that we've come across when it comes to port development and also supply chain, because effectively you have a question around like, who pays for it? Is it government? Well, it's probably a bit too much for government to pay for all of it, but then again, it's quite risky for developers to pay for all of it either. And I think if we think about the CFD model and the way that we develop these auctions, effectively you have the certainty that you've got the contract and you're going to have the revenue stream a bit too late when it comes to developing the supply chain. So ideally you would be able to make the investment before you enter into a CFD contract, but of course that's quite risky. So I think right now in the UK we've got a really live conversation around are there other institutions that could help with this de-risking mechanism, can co-invest with the private sector. We've got a UK infrastructure bank that could potentially play a role here, but also, is there any way of rewarding developers to be able to bear this risk quite early on? And I think it's really important because we really need these ports to develop the floating offshore wind in particular, and it's becoming a huge bottleneck, so we really need to sort it out. I think also when it comes to developers investing in it, again, we're coming against this problem where under the CFD we've seen a race to the bottom on prices, margins are very small, I think it's becoming increasingly difficult to make the case for, well, you need to invest these huge amounts of money in the supply chain and in building the ports. So I guess it's about, you know, whose risk is it to bear, whose balance sheet does it sit on, and that's something that we need to solve.
Thank you. We're going to come in for landing now, but maybe just one last comment or question towards Andreas. And this was a little bit to pick up on this here. So one thing, you put a CFD framework in place, you've got qualitative criteria. What about co-investing with industry, about building infrastructure, putting up on Anna's point? What's Norway's reflections on that?
I mean, I think the points are really good, but this is where I think it's really difficult to think about how we're going to do this going forward. Because, I mean, these structures here, they're as big as football stadiums, right? They're absolutely huge. So obviously, if we're going to produce 1,000 of them just for the Norwegian market towards 2040, we need a lot of infrastructure around that. And then we know what governments are good at, and we know what governments are not so good at, right? So deciding which ports should be invested in is probably not a very smart thing for governments to really intervene in, because all I know is that we need to utilize all port infrastructure around the North Sea in a smart way. That's sort of my approach, and then we have to try to establish a good framework on how we're able to do that in practice. And I think if you go through all the elements of the supply chain, this is how the government need to think. We need to sort of establish a framework that is trustworthy enough and where the risk is low enough that the investments will come. And then I believe that we should state that if we just wait, investment will come. The market will find solutions to a lot of these problems. Because at some point the electricity price will start converging towards the cost of building the marginal technology, which is probably offshore wind when we see the amount of renewable power we're going to need going forward. Our issue from a government perspective is that we do not have that time. We cannot wait until the electricity price and the market solves this by itself. So when we work on establishing this framework, our thought on how we need to work on this is, okay, how do we sort of push this forward faster than the market would solve it by itself? And I believe that for the 2020s and 2030s, this will mean a new role for governments, new industrial policies, not going back to the 1970s or anything like that, but engaging together with supply chains in a very new way. And then the challenge when we do that is that we need to find efficient and smart financing structures that ensure that we utilize the government toolbox in an efficient manner. And I'll be very, very honest that we're not there yet from the Norwegian side, so we need to develop new policies. And the challenge is that EU is thinking long and hard about that. UK is thinking a lot about this. So we need to think together on how to do this and how we utilize our common supply chain in efficient manner to achieve our targets.
Excellent. Thank you. That's a great summary for that. So I want to say to everybody, particularly to our panelists, so Stine, Anne, Andreas, Tor, and Kjetil, thank you so much. A round of applause to them. Thank you. And then we've got some last summary comments from Håkon Bårdud. He's the chair of BNCC and a partner at First House, and we'll take our seats. Thank you.
Can you hear me now? Yes. Thank you very much. I've been asked to sum up this small issue in about 30 seconds. And I think to sum it up, I will use the words of somebody a bit more famous than me. Yes, we can. What I hear is golden opportunities, big business, political issues that needs to be solved for sure, a huge balancing act between a big array of stakeholders, but we can do it. Norway and UK together can do it. We can build a powerhouse in Europe. But what I hear is there is a need for speed, especially on the Norwegian side of things. We need to strengthen and even out our supply chains and value chains. We need grid planning is of the essence, and we also need to talk together more and we need to talk openly. So events like this is the contribution of the BNCC to this. We will have several more events on offshore wind and renewable energies. And thank you very much to Stephen, thank you to the panelists, thank you to Aker Solutions for hosting this and inviting us. And I hope you will stay for a while after this and talk together, because there's about 100 people over here now with lots of ideas of how we can solve all these problems. So please talk together, please get to know each other, and please let us meet informally as well as formally. Thank you very much.